Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we will be talking about the Imperial Guard, but not quite the Imperial Guard. We will be talking about the Penal Legions. As the name already suggests, these are not entirely voluntary formations. They are, technically speaking, a part of the Imperial Guard, although they are generally speaking not deployed as regiments would be. They are not deployed in their own units, so to say. You wouldn't send a Penal Legion to take a specific objective. You would attach Penal Legion detachments of varying sizes to other forces. For example, a Cadian shock army might have a Penal Legion attached to it, consisting of a few thousand individuals, who would then receive their orders from the Imperial Guard command structure, e.g., in this case, the regimental command, and they would then operate as a part of that Imperial Guard unit for all intents and purposes. Exactly like how a unit of Sentinels might be attached to a regiment, or perhaps a unit of Leman Russ tanks, etc. Although granted, on a very, very, very few and very, very special occasions, the Penal Legions might be deployed as a unit in their own right, but this is almost never done in a war zone manner. Deployments like this are almost always overseen by the Inquisition, the Ordo Xenos, Malus Hereticus, or possibly, and this is even rarer, they might be given a highly specialized mission by the Grand Lords of the Imperium itself. Now, do bear in mind, this doesn't have to be the High Lords, but a planetary governor, for example, assuming he has enough leeway within the various controlling organs of the higher administratum, might be able to dispatch a unit of technically Penal Legion troops on very specific tasks, although in this case they wouldn't in all their reality be true Penal Legion, so hell, the word Penal Legion in and of itself is quite flexible, and it is supposed to be so. Penal Legion troops can be practically anything. They can be used as even relatively advanced and competent shock troops. In some cases, they can be used as good old-fashioned meat shields. Occasionally, particularly useless regiments will simply be marched into minefields to clear the way for actually competent troops. And hell, in some cases, Penal Legion troops can themselves be used as highly specialized elite forces. Granted, highly specialized elite forces that has absolutely no say in what they're going to be ordered to do, but pretty damn good at what they're doing nevertheless. Essentially, Penal Legion is a catch-all term for formations of what is, technically speaking, Imperial Guardsmen who have been forced into service after committing some form of crime, and this crime can vary greatly, as it is entirely up to the individual Imperial world, and in many cases, seeing as a lot of the recruits do come from Imperial Guard regiments, the regiment in question, what manner of crime and or infraction might be punished by a position in a Penal Legion. Generally speaking, these crimes are things like murder, rape, pillaging, stuff that wouldn't be accepted in everyday society, either within Imperial Guard regiments, although in this case, of course, murder is of a slightly different type, or within civilian life. However, on occasion, the Imperium finds itself in need of more troops to throw into the everlasting meat grinder, in which case, Penal Legion status can be offered up to people who have committed lesser crimes. Essentially, prisoners will be given a choice. You may enroll in a Penal Legion, or serve out your full sentence. That full sentence will of course almost invariably be made considerably harsher, what with the prisoner already having refused salvation. Think violent prison rape just on a daily basis. And if times are particularly hard, there might be other crimes that could be punished by a Penal Legion posting. For example, stealing somebody's teddy bear, or speaking ill of the local Lord Governor. Whatever is required to fill up the ranks, essentially. And occasionally, if the need is especially grave, entire planets may be turned into penal colonies that produce Penal Legions. One such example was the Imperial mining world of Savalar, a nasty piece of rock in and of itself, being a toxic hellhole, infamous for its sheer shittiness of existence. It used to be a rich, world, rich in ore and chemical deposits, and it used to produce lots and lots of nice stuff for the Imperium. But, as with all things, the resources eventually ran dry, and once the planet started to fail to meet its imperial heights, the Imperium decided that the entire planet would be turned into a penal colony. They would start shipping all manners of traitors, deviants, and criminals to this colony to mine out whatever meager riches remained on the planet, and I hasten to remind you, this was a toxic hellhole before they found themselves having to strip mine everything to find what they were looking for. You can imagine how remarkably terrible this place would be to work at the best of times. Essentially, you're working in a mine where you are trying to find veins of toxic minerals. And now, you have to do this while nobody gives even the faintest fucking shit about whether or not you live past supper because you are a traitor. It's a pretty bad place to live. And due to this simple fact that living arrangements are less than adequate, most people caught on the prison world will happily sign up for a role in a penal legion. And not only that, they will fight like a pair of dogs with stakes strapped to their assholes for the privilege of being thrown headfirst at the Imperium's enemies, armed with little more than a toothbrush and the occasional flashlight. Though, again, there are always exceptions to the rules. This is why they're colloquially called penal legions, because calling them anything specific would be almost entirely pointless, since practically every single goddamn penal regiment has some variant of the standard rule set. And let's use Savlar again as an example. You see, the regiment that plant is most famous for is the Savlar Chem Dogs. This regiment was originally created as an emergency measure because it turns out that if you take large quantities of people, shove them into toxic mines, risk their lives every single day, and then on top of that treats them like absolute shit, then they tend to be somewhat aggressive towards their overlords. And this is precisely what happened. The population of Savlar rose up in violent revolt against the local... Well, I was about to say planetary governor there, but that also is not entirely correct, since penal colonies are not ruled by planetary governors, they are ruled by Adeptus Arbites judges. Irregardless of the leader's title, however, they rose up in violent revolt against the, controlling elements of society, shall we perhaps say. And they were doing pretty damn well, because there's not a whole lot of a guard presence on such a world. A penal colony world is rarely considered to be important enough for even a token garrison of Imperial Guard troops. Mostly there's just a handful of guards, and those guards are not Adeptus Arbites personnel. They are simply just people from the planet that have been promised that if they are willing to beat the shit out of their fellow man, then they will be treated less shitty than the rest of them. Which is a surprisingly convincing argument when you consider just how fucking poorly the people of a penal colony are treated. And it was precisely this argument that would in fact turn many of these citizens against their own. They were promised to be inducted into a new penal legion, but with a very different rule set. Generally speaking, penal legions operate in kind of the same way that Imperial Guard units does when it comes to rules and regulations, except penal legions, of course, are way, way stricter. Looting and or stealing something might get you flogged in some regiments, or a pat on the back in some others, but generally speaking, in a penal guard regiment, doing such a thing is going to get you shot, which is why it's generally not done. However, the Savlar Chem Dogs were promised that if they were to beat down the rebellion, and then agree to be exported as penal legion troops, they would get to steal everything they wanted. Now, granted, of course, the license to steal would not extend to other Imperial Guard regiments or citizens, although they do a lot of that as well, but they would be allowed to take anything from anybody that they killed, provided, of course, that they'd been told to kill them by their local commissar. And if you've been living your entire life in a toxic hellhole and you've never even so much as heard of the sun, that might sound like a pretty damn good fucking deal. And indeed, the people of Salvar believe that as well, and so large quantities of these newly formed penal regions were turned swiftly around and used to beat down their friends who didn't take the outstretched hand of the Emperor. And now the Savlar Chem Dogs fight for the Emperor's redemption and loot for the Imperium of Man. And in fact, the Savlar Chem Dogs have become one of those kind of elite-ish regiments that I mentioned earlier. They have specialized themselves in tunnel fighting, perhaps unsurprising considering where they come from, being, made up entirely of toxic fucking tunnels, so not too odd that they have a certain affinity for it. And additionally, tunnel fighting is, generally speaking, very, very, very dangerous. As such, you don't really want to be throwing Imperial Guardsmen at it. After all said and done, Imperial Guardsmen are pretty expensive, considering all of the fancy gear you have to give them, Vox Speeds, Lasguns, Vox Casters, etc. Not to mention the fact that you do actually have to train them for a fairly considerable amount of time, actually. So, generally speaking, if you are given the choice between wasting a Chem Dog or an Imperial Guardsman, the Chem Dog's gonna get dead every single time. But that doesn't really matter to the Chemdog. After all, his survival chances in a penal legion are still a hell of a lot better than they were back on Savlar. And that's really saying something, considering a Chemdog's chances of surviving a single engagement, much less so an entire campaign, would make a snowball in hell fall to its knees and thank the gods for their mercy. Oh, and of course, the more observant amongst you might have noticed their specific name, the Savlar Chem Dogs. That is because before they go into battle, they are pumped full of all sorts of funny chemicals that makes them hyper-aggressive. This is a fairly common practice within the penal legions because humans are usually somewhat reticent to run screaming towards heavy machine guns. However, if you dope the living shit out of them first, you will find that they are far more easily persuaded to do so. Granted, you need the correct type of dope, but luckily the Imperium is mass-producing the perfect variant, known as Frenzon, which the not entirely subtle name should give you a decent indication of what it does. But let's get back to some of the more general information about the Penal Legion for a bit, shall we? So, obviously, as I mentioned previously, Penal Legions are very rarely employed as units in their own right, although again, there are several examples of that not being true because, again, penal legions don't really follow any truly standardized rule sets, but basically, a penal legion will follow a few common rules at all times. 1. Every single member of the penal legion will be equipped with a magnetically locked collar. This collar includes a small explosive device, which is directed towards the penal legionary's spine. I'm thinking you can probably be guessing what this device is meant to do, and the detonator for said device is of course in the hands of the local commissar. Secondly, penal legions are almost always commanded by commissars. Now again, this is one of those rules that I say is an pretty much always rule, but there is one or two exceptions. See why I fucking hate penal legions? Generally speaking, I can line out a specific set of doctrines or rules that these units will follow, but with the penal legions, the only real thing they have in common is that they all carry a small explosive device attached to the back of their neck, and that's pretty much fucking it. Their weapons vary hugely. Many of them will be equipped with surplus lasguns, often of older designs or stuff that has been outright rejected. In fact, there was a funny little tidbit I read in a book ages ago, so old in fact that it might very well go under the definition of proper old law, so I don't even know if it's canon anymore, but it does sound like it would kinda make sense in a twisted, ridiculous way. Essentially, the tech priests of Mars would of course test every single weapon that they created. The weapons that failed said test, for one reason or another, would then be sent to the penal legions. Now, on one hand, that sounds like it would make sense just because it's such an utter and complete cunt move that I can imagine some fucker up the administratum ladder going like, ha 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 ha, this'll teach the little fucks. But on the other hand, It seems like a remarkably unmechanicus waste of resources, doesn't it? But while the standard issue Imperial lasgun is the preferred weapon because it's way easier to supply, the Imperium produces bajillion, million, trillion, zillions of the damn things, and they don't have to worry supplying them with ammunition, while normally Imperial Guard regiments will be resupplied with ammunition packs once the old ones die out and the battery finally goes flat. Good fucking luck trying that in a Penal Legion. But on the other hand, where the usual Imperial Guardsman is a driven thief when it comes to acquiring extra weapons, ammunitions, and armor, there's no thief quite like a Penal Legion thief. Especially as there's a fair few commissars that will simply overlook even the most blatant cases of theft, because they want these little criminal bastards to complete their missions, and if nobody has seen them steal it, and nobody's coming to the commissar's tent to bitch about it, well, hear no theft, see no theft, and only occasionally commit theft. However, back to the point of the lasguns. While the lasguns is the preferred weapon, because it means they don't have to supply them with anything else for, well, pretty much ever, they only need to occasionally send a few Adeptus Mechanicus adepts to look over the equipment, because, generally speaking, the attrition rate within a Penal Legion is going to be more than enough to ensure that there will be plenty of additional lasguns to go around. But if that is not possible, they might be equipped with whatever is easiest to acquire. Maybe there is a large amount of spare autoguns just laying around after an Underhive raid, for example. That'll work. Or hell, maybe they can't get a hold of any proper weapons, so they'll just give them sharpened pikes or something. And that is, of course, only if the Imperium is feeling generous enough to actually sharpen the metal rods before handing it to them. Hell, that's assuming they'll feel generous enough to give them metal rods, instead of just sending them off into the forest with the instructions to make some. And as for armor, you didn't actually think they'd give them armor, did you? Come on now. A Penal Legionary's only duty is to get his ass turned into grass, and therefore be given the Emperor's salvation. If your only goal is to die gloriously in battle, why would you want armor? That defeats the entire point. And besides, there's nobody stopping you from simply just stealing some armor if you absolutely want it. Granted, of course, if you actually get caught, you're going to be dead, but you're dead anyway, aren't you? So, why not? Besides this, shall we say, inconsistent level of standardization, there's not a whole lot of common rules. However, there are, of course, some uses of Penal Legions that are more common than others. For example, sending them across minefields without minesweepers. This is normally seen as a bit of a waste of manpower, however, as, well, they might just be Penal Legionaries, but minefields can usually be cleared easier with artillery shells. Though, again, artillery shells can occasionally be considered to be quite expensive, and Penal Legionaries, well, they're free. But normally speaking, they wouldn't be wasted on something quite so cuntish. They would be far more used simply just walking in front of actual troops, absorbing most of the enemy's firepower while letting the actual guardsmen take the objectives. This is actually a fairly common way of using them, especially in theatres of war that have grown very stagnant. They have, for example, been used on several occasions by the Death Corps of Krieg, to simply just walk in front of the actual soldiers with orders to not lie down, and there's commissars behind them to make sure that they're not disobeying that order, and therefore screen the following troops. They can also be used as expendable cannon fodder used to buy time. For example, there's occasionals where Imperial Guard regiments will have to retreat, but the enemy, being the inconsiderate cunts that they are, will often want to pursue said Imperial Guard regiments. How do you fix this? Well, you'll throw a couple regiments of Penal Legionaries at them. There's not going to be a whole lot of surviving legionaries left, but the actual regiment is going to be getting out scot-free. There's also several non-combat uses for Penal Legions. Seeing as they do not, of course, have the right to refuse any order, they can be set to do virtually anything. Although it will usually involve back-breaking amounts of hard manual labour. Alternatively, if the Penal Legion is not going to be used in a direct battlefield role, and is not going to be used for good old-fashioned manual labour, they are also quite frequently sent out to deal with things that normal troopers just aren't really equipped to. For example, they might be sent to particularly hostile worlds, death worlds, or airless rocks, taking back asteroids fields, and other very, very uncomfortable and almost certainly lethal tasks. Precisely like in the example of the Savla Chemdogs being excellent tunnel fighters. Tunnel fighting is not only remarkably deadly, but also unusually uncomfortable. And sending the Penal Legions to such hellholes also has another benefit, namely the fact that they will be out of sight and out of mind of the proper Imperial Guardsmen. Now, obviously, serving alongside a Penal Legion can in and of itself be somewhat disturbing. One, because these humans are essentially cattle that will be expected to throw themselves over razor wire so as to provide bridges for the proper soldiers, and secondly, because they steal like gypsies. They will steal everything and anything that isn't bolted down, and you can bet your pretty little ass that they will be bringing a cutting torch so that they can steal what is bolted down and the bolts used to secure it to the floor as well. And that is all assuming that these are actually humans. You see, as with any truly progressive universe, 40k has made it illegal to be different from the vast majority of humanity, and so being a mutant is obviously punishable by death and or service in a Penal Legion. And it's pretty much always going to be and death. There is no way out of a Penal Legion, or, well, actually, there is one way. If a Penal Legionary manages to pull off something truly ridiculous, so absolutely insane show of valor, he might be rewarded with the elevation into a normal guard regiment. Granted, that still doesn't elevate his odds of survival by a huge margin, but Imperial Guard regiments are allowed to leave the Imperial Guard if they, as well, do something truly amazing. You have better odds winning the lottery with the numbers provided to you by a psychic cat than you do getting out of the Penal Legions alive. God Emperor knows I'd put my faith in the cat. But if you're really, really desperate, then there is one way out. And that is to join the 13th Penal Legion, also known as the Last Chances. This is a very, very special Penal Legion, commanded by Colonel Schaefer, one of the hardest motherfuckers in the entire goddamn Imperium to not wear carapace armor. The 13th Penal Legion is a formation of men that can vary in size from upwards of several thousands to a few dozens, and are sent in to do things that are essentially just fucking impossible, like, for example, invading a demon world and killing a demon prince. And this particular Penal Legion is quite unique, and it operates in a very interesting way. It could perhaps be said to be divided into two different sections: the 13th Penal Legion and the Last Chances. The 13th Penal Legion as a whole will be deployed in large-scale actions, often containing several thousand members, and will be sent to do things like, for example, the invasion of a demon world, or throwing themselves at a hive city, or desperate rearguard actions against the Tyranids or something like that, stuff that's essentially impossible. And the handful of survivors, often numbering in the mere dozens, if that much, will then be inducted into the Last Chances, and be led by Colonel Schaefer himself on even more suicidal fucking missions, but this time under the direct supervision of the Inquisition. Essentially, the 13th Penal Legion, as a large-scale organization, exists to, separate the wheat from the chaff, so to say, to kill off all but the craziest, hardest, motherfucking murderous cocksuckers in the entire galaxy. We're talking the Simon Phoenixes of 40k here, basically. And then send these remaining crazies on suicide missions that only they could have even the slightest hope of succeeding, and if they fail, well, Penal Legionaries, they are, to say the absolute least, expendable. And the last chances actually have a surprisingly high success rate, mostly because they are led by the Colonel Schaefer, one of the biggest badasses to have ever walked the galaxy, as mentioned, without wearing power armor. In fact, he's such a massive badass that he was originally designed on Arnold Schwarzenegger's character in the movie Predator, which is cool enough in and of itself. And Colonel Schaefer promises redemption to every man and woman within the 13th Penal Legion, and he never fails to make good on that promise, even if he has to deliver the Emperor's mercy himself. But supposedly, somebody did actually live. Somebody did actually make it through some of these ridiculous missions and receive a pardon. God Emperor alone knows who, or if that's even true to begin with, but what's the old saying? Some hope is better than no hope. Even if that hope is so slim that it makes the aforementioned snowball in hell look like Bear Grylls in New York Central Park. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.